Good evening and welcome to an all-new episode of Mystery, Murder, and Mayhem. Before we get started tonight, I just want to apologize for not any new content last week. It was a rough week. You might remember that I found the 2 lumps on Ariel, and we were waiting to see if any of them grew, and the one on her side did grow. So, it was tested and we found out that it is cancer. So, that was news, of course, that I didn't want to hear. But, when I adopted her, I knew that it could come back. She could have cancer again. Because you may remember I told you that when I adopted her, she was recovering from having an enormous tumor removed. But, I knew it could happen, but you know how you have that hope and wish that it doesn't happen again, and it's still devastating when it does, even though you knew. But, the doctor feels like, they can take care of it again, make her better. They've got to wait for it to get just a little bit bigger before they can remove it. So there's, that waiting and whatnot, and hopefully it's not spreading through her body. But, so yeah, that was my week last week. So I was just spending some time with my sweet baby. But, yeah. So anyway, if you've been listening over the past couple of weeks, you know that we've been talking about the Murdaugh case that's going on here in South Carolina right now. And tonight I'm wrapping it up with what we know so far in the case, or cases, I should probably say, against Alex Murdaugh. So, without further ado, let's get things started.
What are you out of here? Could be a nightmare. But for the victim, it is real life. Welcome to Mystery, Murder, and Mayhem. Listen at your own discretion.
Okay, y'all, so before we dig back into the case, I'm just going to give y'all a little refresher, a little recap on what we've talked about so far. Now, as far as we know, the story began when Alex's son, Paul, was charged with several felonies that stemmed from the boating accident that happened while he was heavily under the influence of alcohol, and a 19-year-old woman named Mallory Beach, which is the same age Paul was at this time, she was killed in that accident. Well, towards the end of episode 80, which was the first episode in this little mini-series, I mentioned that Alex Murdaugh had found his wife and son shot to death out by his dog kennels. And during the investigation into that, some information was found that reopened the investigation into the supposed hit and run death of Stephen Smith. Now, we don't know what that information was that was found, but it had something that maybe linked the Murdaughs somehow to the death of Stephen Smith. Well, 8 days after Paul and Maggie were found shot to death, Alex and Buster announced that they were offering a $100,000 reward for any information that would lead to the arrest and conviction of whoever was responsible for the deaths of Maggie and Paul. The SLED established a tip line for receiving tips and information on their deaths, and to be eligible to receive that award, you had to either submit your tip to SLED through that hotline or by calling Crime Stoppers by the end of September of 2021. Now, I don't know that I've ever heard of an expiration date on submitting tips to help solve a crime before, but as you know, this whole Murdaugh fiasco, it's not your cookie cutter crimes. There's just so many twists and turns. And then on last week's episode, I talked about how Alex was either forced to quit or he voluntarily quit from the family's law firm because he had been scamming some clients out of money. That includes the family of Gloria Satterfield, who was the nanny and housekeeper for the Murdaugh family. She had been their nanny and housekeeper for over 20 years, I believe. And she had been killed while she was there at their house in what was called a trip and fall accident. And it seems that Alex promised Mrs. Satterfield's sons around $500,000 by suing himself, but it ended up that he put all the money, and it was like over $4 million, in this bogus bank account, and those sons never saw a penny of it. He also scammed several other clients in nearly the same way. So after the family law firm found out that this was going on, they either asked him to resign or they forced him to, or maybe he just did it on his own. But then the day after he resigned, he called 911 and said that he had been shot in the head while he was pulled over changing a flat tire. Well, then he admitted later that he had gotten his, for lack of better words, drug dealer, Curtis Edward Smith, to drive by and shoot him so that he would die. And Buster, his one remaining child, would collect a $10 million life insurance payout that Buster wouldn't receive if Alex had killed himself. Well, after he's released from the hospital for that gunshot wound to the head, Alex checked himself into a rehab center in Orlando, Florida, and while he's there, he gets slapped with a bunch of new charges. Now, I also told y'all that Mr. Satterfield's remains will be exhumed because there's a lot of questions about why an autopsy was never performed and why the coroner was never called in to investigate her death. And right now, there's still no date that's been set on when this is supposed to take place, but we know that it could take several weeks or many weeks for the results once it does take place. Let's see. Like I said, there's just so much to this, and it's really unbelievable, and it surpasses anything we could have ever imagined. It's kind of like a Lifetime movie, and I'm sure there will be one. Now, before I jump into this year's events in the case, there's a couple of things that I have failed to mention, but I want to talk about them now. Now, on September the 20th of last year, Connor Cook, you might remember me talking about him in the first episode of this miniseries. He was one of the victims in the boat crash that involved Paul. He filed a lawsuit in Hampton County, and it's not just Alex Murdaugh that he's suing. He's also he also named Buster Murdaugh, Gregory M. Parker Incorporated, which is the company that owns the convenience store that Paul bought the alcoholic beverages at, and an employee at, that worked at Parker's, or it was an employee of Parker's, and that employee's name is Tajia Cohen. And now this is because they did play somewhat of a role in this boat crash. And you might remember me telling you that Connor, as he's being rolled down the hall, going to surgery for the injuries that he sustained in that boat crash, Alex is walking along with him, urging him basically not to rat his boy out. Well, anyway, later on, that same month of September, on the 30th, a family representative responded to claims of the marital issues that had came out between Maggie and Alex. And this is what they said, and it's a quote, okay? So, the most recent allegations by People magazine regarding the state of Maggie and Alex Murdaugh's marriage are totally inconsistent with what we have been told by friends and family members. Also, we have reviewed many years of text messages on Alex's phone, and the conversations between Alex and Maggie portray a very loving relationship. It is our hope that the media will continue to focus on covering the investigation of the person or people responsible for the murder of Maggie and Paul, and not reporting salacious stories with no credible sources connected to the Murdaugh family. And that's the end of that quote. Well, then on October the 6th, the PMPD law firm files a lawsuit against Alex, suing him for damages that came from him taking money from them and clients. And it's believed that he conspired with some friends who were an attorney and a banker to scam money from the Satterfields. Well, 2 days later, on the 8th, the South Carolina Supreme Court suspended the law license of Corey Fleming, who is that attorney friend that Murdaugh is accused of conspiring with. So then on the 14th, and this is in October, y'all, Alex comes out of rehab, and he's charged with 2 counts of obtaining property by false pretenses in connection with Gloria Satterfield's wrongful death settlement. He's extradited back to South Carolina, and on the 19th of October, a bond hearing is held, and the judge rules that he'll be held in custody pending a psychiatric evaluation. So there's that. Well, on November 4th, Alex and Curtis Edward Smith are indicted by the Hampton County Grand Jury on multiple charges in connection to the assisted suicide plot, and Alex is denied bond again, which is still pending the psychiatric evaluation. Well, later that same month, he's indicted on 30 charges that stem from the Gloria Satterfield wrongful death settlement. And how that's 30 charges for just that one case. And I wonder if Alex is ever just sitting in jail thinking about what he's up against, and he forgets to include a case or two, and he's like, oh shit, yeah, there's that too. I don't know how he could keep up with all of it, because, we are having a hard time keeping up with it ourselves. But, yeah. Well, then at the beginning of December of last year, another victim in the boat crash, Anthony Cook, he files a lawsuit against Alex, Gregory M. Parker Incorporated, Parker's Corporation, and Tajia Cohen, which, like I said, is an employee of Parker's. So these lawsuits just keep rolling in. And that year, or last year, it couldn't end without adding one more slap on the wrist to Alex Murdaugh. He's given a $7 million bond for the charges from South Carolina grand jury indictments. And of course, this infuriates him. And his defense attorney, he's just trying to defend his client, of course. But, he tells him that, Murdaugh can't afford a bond like that because he's as broke as the rest of us. So, Merry Christmas, Alex, because you're spending it in jail. All right, so now it's this year, 2022, and you'd think there couldn't possibly be any more charges to be pressed against Alex Murdaugh. And then, boom, y'all, more hits the fan. Now, I do want to tell you now that since a lot of this is recent, there's not a whole lot of details that's been released on some of it just yet. But I'm going to tell you what we do know. So in January, Dick Harpootlian, that's Murdaugh's attorney, he asked the judge for a reduction in that bond. And he tells the judge that Alex is so poor he can't even pay his own phone bill. The judge thinks on it for a couple of weeks, but in the end, that request was denied. Gosh, I can't talk this morning or this evening. Now Murdaugh gets slapped with 23 more charges by the South Carolina grand jury, and this time it's for breach of trust and computer crimes. And those computer crimes tie into those charges of defrauding clients out of money. Well, later that month, the Moselle property, which is the property that Maggie and Paul were found murdered on, went up for sale for $3.9 million. And in an effort to keep Alex from collecting any money from the sale of that estate, Mallory Beach's mom, Morgan Doty, and that was Paul's girlfriend at the time of that boat crash, and Miley Altman, they filed creditors' claims totaling $65 million, and $50 million of that being from Mallory's mom. Now, on Valentine's Day of this year, Morgan Doty, like I said, she was the girlfriend of Paul Murdaugh at the time of that boat crash. She filed her own lawsuit against Alex Murdaugh, Buster Murdaugh, the estates of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, and Parker's. Now, Doty's lawsuit alleges that there was negligence against Parker's for failing to notice that Paul was underage, even though he had his brother's driver's license and his daddy's credit card to purchase that alcohol. Now, the lawsuit also says that Maggie and Alex were actually aware of Paul's drinking problem. They did absolutely nothing about it. And photos on social media that depict Paul consuming alcoholic beverages, they were liked by his own mom, Maggie, and these have been referenced in the case. So I guess her liking his drinking photos on social media, that shows that she knew something about it and didn't do anything about it. But early in the spring, it was kind of quiet for Alex, but then on May the 4th, the South Carolina grand jury indicted Murdaugh, Corey Fleming, that was that attorney friend of his, and a former bank CEO, a man named Russell Lucius Lafitte. I'm thinking I'm saying that's wrong, or how I'm pronouncing it's wrong. But anyway, they were slapped with a total of 30 criminal charges, and that banker CEO, the former one, he is accused of conspiring with Murdaugh to defraud victims of $1.8 million. Now, see what I mean about it just going on and on and on? It just don't stop. And I guess he's feeling defeated, or that he didn't have a choice. On May the 31st, he signed a confession of judgment warning the family of Gloria Satterfield $4.3 million. So maybe, just maybe a little bit of justice for at least one of the Murdaugh family victims is starting to slowly trickle in. And it just depends on what is found when they exhume Gloria Satterfield's body. But that family may get more justice in the future. I guess it just depends on what they find when they do exhume her body and autopsies and whatnot. Well, about a year and a week after the deaths of Maggie and Paul, South Carolina Supreme Court announces that it wants to revoke Alex's law license due to the overwhelming evidence that he stole millions of dollars from his clients, plus the 70 plus criminal charges that haven't been resolved yet. Now, Alex's attorney didn't dispute that, so that was that. That was finalized, and Alex was disbarred on July the 12th. Well, on June 28th, a ton more charges against Alex poured in that range from money laundering to criminal conspiracy. And then there's narcotics involved in this too, y'all. For these indictments, prosecutors laid out that there had been an 8-year money laundering and painkiller ring. Apparently, they had been conspiring to purchase and distribute oxycodone, and this took place in Colleton County from October the 7th of 2013 to September the 7th, 2021. So stuff with the Murdaughs has been going on for quite some time. But then the calendar flips to July 14th, and the entire state of Carolina, maybe even the entire nation, heard the words they've been waiting to hear. Murdaugh was indicted on 2 counts of murder in the deaths of his wife Maggie and his son Paul. Now, it was almost like the South exhaled like all at one time. So we've been kind of like holding our collective breath, waiting on that indictment, and we finally had it. But now we hold it again while we wait for this circus to go to trial. Well, 3 days after he was indicted for those murders, he's brought into a Colleton County courtroom, and surprise, surprise, he enters a plea of not guilty. Yeah. I mean, of course he would. I mean, he's never admitted guilt to anything, so why on earth would he say he's guilty of killing his wife and his own son? You know? Well, during the bond hearing for the murder charges, Harpootlian called for a speedy trial to clear Murdaugh's name so that the authorities could go find the real killers. Okay? Like I said, he did plead not guilty, but he agreed to stay in jail without bond. Now, Harpootlian said that Murdaugh agreed to no bond so that they didn't have to go through a bond trial and risk new information about the killings being leaked. And that would in turn prejudice potential jurors when the case does go to trial. Well, Harpootlian went on to say that Murdaugh would like to go on trial for those charges within the next 3 or 4 months. Show that SLED targeted the wrong man. However, the prosecutor in the case, his name's Creighton Waters, he thinks that such a timeline would be very aggressive. And not only did he say that, but he said that all evidence points back to Murdaugh, including forensic and other evidence. And the defense also requested a gag order to be put in place to prevent, members of law enforcement and attorneys from talking about the case to the media, but the judge later denied that request. And as for a trial within the next 3 to 4 months, that remains to be seen. Well, so just to let you know, as of August the 5th of this month, Alex Murdaugh, he's facing a total of 88 charges. Now, I do have to say, just before I got ready to record this episode, y'all, it was announced that there would be a bond revocation hearing for Curtis Edward Smith. And that was to take place on August the 11th. That was last week. So I decided to wait and see what the outcome of that was so I could include it on this episode. Well, when Smith's bond trial was held after his arrest, he told the judge that, and this is his quote, I ain't got no money. And that's when he was asked about the state of his finances. Well, after some investigating, it was found that in the weeks before his bond was issued, he'd had $58,000 in his checking account. And that money came from an insurance settlement of $70,000 from an alleged fire at his shop. Now, anybody out there want to take any guess on who represented him in that case? Anybody? Anyone? Well, it was Alex Murdaugh. I mean, easy peasy to guess, right? And also at that revocation hearing, prosecutors voiced concerns that Mr. Smith had been violating his monitoring terms. Apparently he's got a ankle monitor bracelet, anklet, whatever you want to call it. But he'd been violating those terms by going to several different places while he was under house arrest. And so I'm guessing they put him back in jail. But I knew more would be coming out sooner or later about this case. It's just a big old mess, you know. It's so messy. But it would surprise me if more didn't come out this week. I mean, it's just one thing after another in this case. And of course, I'll bring it to y'all, you know, because we can't leave out any details of this messy case. But anyway, now, like I said, this is going to be, as far as I know, the last episode until, you know, more is released or when the trials start, whatever. But, you know, that could be this fall or it could be this week. Like I said, you don't know because it's just so crazy. So hang tight. I have a feeling there will be more updates on this case soon. And that's all I have for tonight. I want to thank y'all for listening, and I want y'all to have a great week.